There's a particular kind of story that unfolds in silence. Not the kind with jump scares, not the kind with monsters in the dark, but the kind where dread seeps in through routine, where the hallways are too quiet, where every screen, every message, every locked door says something without ever saying anything outright. Fort Solis tries to be that kind of story. It tries to whisper. It tries to linger. But here's the truth, it doesn't always succeed. And for a game that markets itself as a psychological sci fi horror experience, not succeeding means more than just a few narrative hiccups. It means we need to ask the hard question, what went wrong? Welcome back to An Author's Perspective. I'm Devin, better known on Twitch as AuthorCypher, and today we're dissecting Fort Solis, a game that looks like prestige television, sounds like a blockbuster, and feels, well, like waiting in a very pretty line. So, what happens when atmosphere isn't enough? What do you get when horror forgets to be horrifying? And what does it teach us, writers, gamers, storytellers, about pacing, presence, and the importance of emotional hooks? Let's talk about it. Let's start with the obvious. Fort Solis is a beautiful game. No one's arguing that. The environmental design, immaculate. The lighting, subtle, deliberate. The station itself feels lived in, touched by people, but abandoned in a way that tells you something happened here. From the moment Jack Larry steps out of his rover, you feel the weight of silence. Not the absence of sound, but the kind of silence that presses against you. And that's where the game really shines, visually and tonally. The way dust kicks up beneath your boots, the flickering lights in empty rooms, the locked terminals, the empty bunks, the dried blood. This is sci fi minimalism at its best. Set dressing that knows when to whisper instead of scream. It reminds me of Moon, the 2009 Duncan Jones film, or even parts of Alien Isolation, where the station becomes a character, eerie, indifferent, isolated. In fact, Mars itself in Fort Solis feels like a metaphor for emotional detachment, cold, silent, completely unaware of human suffering. So the bones are here. The stage is perfectly set. But in storytelling, and this is important, atmosphere isn't the story. You can build the most immersive world in the galaxy, but if the people inside it don't move us, it doesn't matter. And that brings us to the heart of the problem. Roger Clark's performance as Jack Larry is subtle, grounded. He gives us a protagonist who isn't a superhero or a soldier. He's just a guy, an engineer, a responder, sent to check on a routine alert. And in a better paced narrative, that kind of everyman could be compelling. Jessica Appleton, played by Julia Brown, offers a nice counterbalance. Sharper, more frustrated, more urgent. And then there's Dr. Wyatt Taylor, voiced by Troy Baker, bringing the usual gravitas and ambiguity. But here's the thing, none of these characters feel particularly deep. We don't learn much about them outside of their job descriptions. We hear them talk, sure. We hear stress, banter, fatigue. We don't really know who they are beneath that. As a writer, I always say that character drives story, not plot. You can put someone in the most dangerous, most surreal environment possible, but if we don't care about them, it's just window dressing. Think about Lee and Clementine in The Walking Dead. Think about Isaac in Dead Space. Think about Firewatchers Henry and Delilah. These are characters we understand. We see their pain, their regrets, their flaws. In Fort Solis, Jack could be anyone. Jessica could be anyone. Even Taylor, whose descent into delusion should have been fascinating, comes off more like a concept than a person. The game wants us to feel tension, but tension only works if we feel like we have something to lose. When there's emotional investment. Without that, all the dread in the world feels like background noise. Let's address the elephant in the Martian corridor. Fort Solis is not scary. It wants to be. It tries to be. But the horror, if we're being honest, is almost entirely implied, and even then, very rarely effective. You hear it described as a psychological sci fi horror game, but what that really means is It's a slow burn mystery with clinical lighting and a few unsettling logs.
Fort Solis.
There are no monsters, no jump scares,
Suspected
no
bomber
real
has
sense of danger.
information.
Even the moment that should be terrifying,
Okay, Mr.
unexplained
Solis.
noises,
You plan
bloody
on that strong?
handprints, malfunctioning systems, they just feel muted, predictable, too quiet to be terrifying and too slow to be thrilling. There's no chase, no panic, no overwhelming dread that hits your chest and squeezes. The kind of horror that makes games unforgettable just doesn't show up. What we get instead is a creepy sense of something bad happening here, delivered in the past tense. Horror, by nature, needs stakes. It needs uncertainty. Fort Solis keeps you so grounded, so restrained, that it forgets to ever strike. It's like being in a haunted house with the lights on and the ghosts politely announcing themselves via voicemail. And yes, not all horror needs to be visceral. There's room in the genre for nuance, emotional horror, psychological horror, existential horror, but even those need a hook, something that keeps the player's mind reeling, something to haunt you. Fort Solis doesn't haunt, it just sort of plays out, which is a shame because the themes are there: isolation, obsession, consequences, all fertile ground for deeply personal terror, but the execution feels sedated. The only thing you're truly afraid of while playing Fort Solis is how slowly your character walks. Let's talk about pacing, because this is the game's most glaring issue, and it affects everything. Fort Solis is short, around 4 to 5 hours, but it feels longer, not because it's dense, but because it's slow, painfully slow. Jack moves like he's wading through molasses, and while that may sound like a nitpick and narrative driven experience, pacing is everything. You can't build tension if the player's bored. You can't build dread if the movement undermines the urgency. I understand the artistic intent. This is supposed to be a grounded, methodical unraveling of a mystery, but it comes at the cost of interactivity, at the cost of momentum. The game's own mechanics are working against its narrative. And there's a broader issue here. When you make the game feel like a show, but strip away the tools that make show engaging, cuts, edits, pacing, timing, you're left with empty space. You can't just ask the player to watch for 5 hours. This isn't a Netflix series, it's a game, which means you need to either make the story compelling enough to earn that passivity, or you need to give the players more agency. Let's do a quick comparison. In What Remains of Edith Finch, you walk through a house slowly, but every room, every interaction, feels like the narrative. There's no dead space, no filler. The pacing is deliberate, but never sluggish. Fort Solis has long stretches where you're doing nothing of narrative value. Walking to a panel, pressing a button, waiting, watching. It becomes tedious. The player begins to feel like a delivery guy wandering around an abandoned warehouse, hoping that something will happen. And that's the problem. You can have a slow burn, but only if there's a steady increase in the tension. A slow burn without suspense is just a dim flame in the corner. Now let's give Fort Solis some credit where it's due. Its environmental storytelling is excellent. If the characters fall flat and the plot fizzles, the space itself does a lot of heavy lifting. Every corridor tells a story. Every room has a story someone used to live in. You notice things, like trays left half-eaten, notes scribbled on post-its, personal belongings in bunks, strewn carelessly as if people left in a hurry, or never got to leave at all. It's subtle but effective. You start piecing things together not because the game tells you, but because the environment does. It's the kind of design that trusts the player's intelligence. There's no giant neon sign flashing, "Hey, this guy died here." There's just blood, a chair, an open vent, and silence. And to be fair, that's where Fort Solis is at its strongest, when it's not trying to force horror or pace itself like a movie, but when it just lets the space breathe. That's where I see the bones of a better game, a better story, one that lets you uncover tragedy through observation instead of exposition. Because even though the dialogue may be forgettable, the rooms are unforgettable. Even if you don't remember Jack's last line, You remember the eerie glow of the greenhouse, the hum of the comms tower, the lonely elevator descending into the forgotten level. So far, we've seen a game with atmosphere to spare, but a narrative that forgets to ignite. We've met characters that speak but rarely connect. We've explored horror that whispers but never howls. And we've seen pacing that chokes the very tension it's trying to create. And yet, despite all of that, Fort Solis almost works. Because it wants to be better. You can feel the effort, see the care, the belief that silence and slowness could become suspense and sorrow. It just doesn't quite get there. We've tiptoed around the question long enough. Let's put it plainly. Does the story of Fort Solis actually matter? I don't mean in a philosophical way. I mean functionally, narratively. As the core experience you're here to absorb, does the plot deliver anything memorable? For some players, the answer is yes. There's a medical cover-up, a descent into madness, a scientist who breaks protocols for what he believes is a greater good. There's betrayal, tragedy, and eventually death. But for others, and I'd argue for most, the answer is no. Not because those elements aren't present, but because they're delivered in such a clinical, distant manner that they fail to register. You don't feel the unraveling, you observe it. Dr. Taylor, the supposed antagonist, is a man slowly losing his grip on reality, but we never witness his descent. We just hear about it through recordings. We see the aftermath, the spilled blood, the silent terminals. But the emotional arc, the descent into obsession, it's all abstract. Now, in literature, this would be the equivalent of showing a reader a crime scene photo instead of writing the scene. It's cold, detached, sanitized. And while that has some value, it doesn't connect the way a lived moment does. This is where Fort Solis truly stumbles. The game's central mystery, a man who thought he could save everyone but doomed them instead, should be riveting. But without tension, without escalation, without urgency, it feels like reading a closed case file. You nod, you register the facts, and then you move on. So yes, the plot exists, but whether it matters, that depends on how much you're willing to bring to the table as a player. One of Fort Solis' biggest marketing hooks was its cast. Roger Clark, who played Arthur Morgan himself, Troy Baker, Julia Brown. These aren't small names in the voice acting world. Expectations were high. And to be clear, the performances weren't bad. They were professional, well delivered, believable. But here's the strange part. The emotional beats still felt hollow. Why? Because the performances don't have enough story scaffolding to support them. Voice acting is only as good as an emotional context that lives inside. You can give an Oscar-worthy monologue, but if the player doesn't know who you are or why you're in pain, it doesn't land. Let's take Jack. Roger Clark gives him a grounded realism. Calm, tired, maybe a little emotionally numb. And that makes sense in theory. He's a guy doing his job. But the problem is, he stays emotionally numb the entire game. There's no arc, no shift, no visible unraveling. Jack doesn't evolve. He just reacts. And mostly with a dry, quiet tone that rarely changes, even when things get dire. Same with Jessica. She's clearly the more emotional of the two, but she's also sidelined for most of the game. And by the time we hear her panic or pain, it feels too little, too late. Troy Baker's Taylor has the most range, but even he can't fix the fact that we never see his unraveling. We only listen to it through pre-recorded clips, disconnected from the moment. There's no heat to his madness, just cold detachment. And again, this all circles back to one key concept. Storytelling without stakes is just exposition. You can have all the talent in the world behind the mic, but if the player doesn't feel something, tension, fear, empathy, well, honestly, it's just noise. So what can we, as writers and storytellers, learn from Fort Solis? Because even if the game doesn't entirely succeed, it tries something important. It swings for intimacy. It bets on silence. It puts trust in subtlety. And that's not nothing. Fort Solis is a great case study in the limits of environmental storytelling when divorced from an emotional moment. It shows us that world building is not enough, no matter how beautiful or immersive. Without compelling characters, the world's an empty shell. It teaches us that slow pacing can be atmospheric, but only when it builds to something. Suspense is a slow drip, not a stagnant pool. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that horror is not about setting. It's about what the setting does to the people inside of it. If no one screams, no one panics, no one breaks, then the horror is just wallpaper, mood without consequence. From a writer's standpoint, Fort Solis feels like a first draft of something great. The ideas are strong, the structure is there, but it needed more depth, more tension, more feeling. It needed to let the player experience the unraveling, not just witness it from a safe distance. And if you're a writer watching this or a developer working on your first narrative title, take this as a challenge. Don't just write a setting, write suffering, write regret, write people who break, and then put those pieces into a world that hurts to explore. So, what is Fort Solis? It's a beautifully lit corridor with locked doors and good intentions. It's a world drenched in silence, built with precision, but absent of impact. It's all the pieces of compelling narrative, left mostly unassembled. Is it a bad game? Not really. There's too much care, too much polish for that. But it is a disappointment, especially if you came for what the trailers promised. Let's strip it down. Atmosphere? Immaculate. Sound design? Haunting and subtle. Visual fidelity? Stunning, especially for an indie studio. Voice talent? Top tier cast, no question. Story? Emotionally distant. Gameplay? Minimal, bordering on frustrating. Horror? Almost entirely absent. Pacing? Glacial. Stakes? Paper thin. Fort Solis is a game that feels like it's almost something great. The bones are there. You can feel the potential bleeding through the gaps. But the potential doesn't make a compelling experience. Execution does. And that's where it stumbles. As an author, I wanted to feel the characters unraveling. I wanted to watch Jack come apart under pressure. I wanted to see Jessica make an impossible call. I wanted to fear Taylor's mind slipping. I wanted to feel the weight of the death on a dying outpost. But instead, I walked and walked and walked. And by the time I reached the end, the only thing I really felt was tired. So what do we do with a story like Fort Solis? A story that wants to be a psychological descent, but never digs deep enough to find what lies beneath. We learn from it. We learn that mood isn't meaning, that a quiet hallway only matters if something unspeakable happened there, or might again. We learn that characters must be more than dialogue, that having a famous actor voice your lead doesn't make them emotionally compelling if their actions are flat. We learn that pacing isn't just slowness, it's structure, that if your story meanders, players will too. And we learn that horror lives in uncertainty, not just emptiness. That fear is not about where you are, it's about what might happen next. Fort Solis is valuable not because it's perfect, but because it shows us what almost works. It shows us where ambition without emotional escalation can lead. And it reminds writers, of all kinds, that atmosphere alone doesn't make a story resonate. You need stakes. You need loss. You need escalation. You need moments that hurt, characters who break, and choices that cost something. In the end, Fort Solis is a quiet game. Maybe too quiet. It's the kind of story that passes through you if you're not paying attention. But even if you are, it might still feel hollow. It's not a failure, but it's not a triumph either. It's a haunting echo of what could have been. And that, in its own way, is its legacy. A monument of restraint, a whisper in the red dust. Thank you for joining me on this analysis. If you like this breakdown, consider exploring the rest of the series, where we talk about Days Gone, Silent Hill, Red Dead Redemption 2, and other stories that do break us in the right ways. I'm Devin, again better known as AuthorCypher, and this has been an author's perspective. I'll see you next time.